Hello and welcome to our next computer side chat. Today we're going to be talking all about elections. What are they for? What type of elections do we deal with in the United States? And how can you take part in an election when you turn 18? So let's go ahead and get right into it. So first off, what is an election? So an election is the process by which citizens of a country vote an individual into elected office. So that could be voting someone into the presidency, that could be electing a member of Congress, or even someone for your local school board. It's the process by which we choose the people who will fill those vacancies. Now, in the state of Ohio, there are three main requirements that you must meet if you want to be able to vote. The first one I already mentioned is your age. You have to be 18 years of age if you want to vote in Ohio or in the United States as a whole. Secondly is citizenship. And there are two parts to this. The first is you must be a U.S. citizen. And the second part is you must have lived at an Ohio address for at least 1 month prior to an election. So you can't move to the state of Ohio 2 days before an election and cast your vote in that election. You have to have lived here for at least 30 days if you want to vote in an upcoming election. And then lastly, you have to register to vote. So in Ohio, we don't have automatic voter registration. So even if you turn 18, even if you're a U.S. citizen, and even if you live in Ohio and have lived here your whole life, when you turn 18, you still have to register to vote. Generally, this has to be done 30 days before an election. So that is the deadline for voter registration, is you need to have your registration mailed in 1 month prior to an election before you can vote. Any sooner than that, and you cannot vote in that upcoming election. Alright, so let's get into the types of elections now. And there are three main ones that we're going to talk about. The first one is the most prominent, most popular, and the one that most people know about. And those are presidential elections. These happen every 4 years. And these are elections where a president is elected. So 2016 was a presidential election year. The next presidential election year will be 2020, and then 2024 after that. So every 4 years, it's the one that gets the most coverage. It's the one that we have the highest voter turnout for, and people spend the most time paying attention to. That is our biggest election. Next are congressional elections, and these happen every 2 years. These are elections where congressional representatives, such as members of the House or of the Senate, are elected. And these overlap with presidential elections every 2 years. So 2016 wasn't just a presidential election year, it was also a congressional election year. So you would have voted for the president as well as your House representative and at least one of your senators. The other election, or the election in the 2 years after a presidential election, is what is known as a midterm election. And this is a congressional election that comes in the middle of a president's term in office. So our next midterm election is in 2018. That'll be 2 years into Donald Trump's 4 years as president. Midterm elections tend to get a lot of attention because they tend to act as a referendum on a presidential term to that point. So 2 years in, what do people think of the job the president is doing? If that president's party tends to do well in the midterm elections, that's a good reflection on how he's doing. If things go badly for the president's party in a midterm election, that generally means that people aren't happy with the job the president is doing. And then lastly are state and local elections. And these are elections that regard state and local representatives and or issues. And these elections happen every single year. So we had we had state and local elections in 2016. We had them in 2017. We'll have them in 2018, so on and so forth. So in other words, these 4-year cycles where we hit a presidential election, when you go to the ballot to vote or go to your voting precinct, the ballot tends to be pretty full with things that you have to vote for between a president, between your members of Congress, between local representatives or ballot issues. So you can find, depending on what election you're voting in, that there's a ton of different people or issues that you have to understand before you walk into your precinct. So what is the process to getting into these elections? Actually, before I move on to that part, I do want to point out this graph. It's worth noting from 1940 to 2014, this blue bar represents the voter turnout for presidential elections. So 58.2% of citizens turned out to the presidential election in 2012. Now, you can see that there's a big drop to midterm elections in off years, where in 2014, only 36.4% of voters turned out for the midterm election that year. So people tend to not turn out for the midterm elections or for local elections the way they would if a president is on the ballot. Anyways, back to what I was saying. How are elections conducted? Well, they are conducted in 2 steps. The first step are the primaries or caucuses, and the second step is the general election. So let's talk a little bit about those. So what are primaries and caucuses? Think of these as the election before the election. So this is where members of the 2 major political parties vote to choose their party's nominee for an elected office. And a nominee is just a political party's candidate for office, whether that be the presidency, Senate, House, whatever it may be. So in other words, the primaries and caucuses are just a chance for the GOP or for the Democrats to figure out who members of their party like the most. So in 2016, primaries and caucuses showed the Republicans that the most popular candidate was Donald Trump, and primaries and caucuses showed the Democrats that the most popular candidate was Hillary Clinton. So again, these are the elections before the elections. After the primaries and caucuses, we get to the general election. And this is the election where citizens of a state choose who they want to fill an elected office. So where they actually vote on a candidate for real. So whether they vote for a president, whether they vote for a member of Congress, whether they vote for a local or state representative, a general election is where people are actually elected to an office. So we have those primaries and caucuses first. Then after those, after we see who the nominees are going to be for each party, then the general election is held in November, and that's where we figure out who's going to actually hold office and which of the 2 parties won that position. So let's go ahead and dive into the general election, because that's kind of the most important thing and the thing that we focus on the most and care the most about. And let's start with the general election for congressional positions. So first, let's talk about the U.S. House of Representatives. So the U.S. House reps in this body are elected by a majority of citizens in their congressional district. So if you look over here at this map, this is a map of the 16 congressional districts in the state of Ohio. There are 16 districts because the state of Ohio has 16 House representatives. And so for each of these districts, only the people in those districts vote for who will represent them. And you can kind of see over here in district number 4, this weird looking district here, this includes Union County. So congressional district number 4 is where Marysville and Union County are located. The current representative for that district is a guy named Jim Jordan. You can see his picture right here on the far right. Next, let's move into the Senate. So, senators are elected by a majority of citizens in the entire state. So whereas House representatives are only elected by a small portion of the state they represent, senators are elected by the entire state. So our 2 senators, because each state has 2 senators. The entire state of Ohio votes for them when they come up for election. Our 2 senators are, on the left here is Rob Portman, who is a Republican, and then in the middle is Sherrod Brown, who is a Democrat. All right, let's get into the most interesting election of all, and those are presidential general elections. So how does the presidential election work? And this is where things get a little weird, because while congressional representatives are elected by the popular vote, or who got the most votes, presidents are elected by what is known as the Electoral College. So, to give a better answer for that, how does the presidential election work? The winner of the presidential election is the individual who receives the majority of electoral votes from the Electoral College. The majority would be 270 electoral votes or more. So, what is the Electoral College then? So, the Electoral College is a group of 538 electors from all 50 states in Washington, D.C., who cast the official votes for president and vice president. So, what are the 538 voters known as? Who are they? Like I said earlier, the 538 voters are known as electors. They can be anyone. They're usually people that have some connection to state government, maybe know somebody, maybe are relatives with somebody in state government, but there's no qualification to be an elector. So basically, when you guys turn 18, you could be an elector in the Electoral College for the state of Ohio if you were well connected enough or know somebody that could put you in that position. So if these 538 electors are the ones that elect the President of the United States, what exactly are we voting for when we go to the polls in presidential years, whether that's 2020 or beyond? Well, you are voting for the electors who have pledged to vote for a specific candidate. These electors then cast the actual ballot for president and vice president later in December. So in other words, when you go to a presidential election, you are voting for who will vote for the president. That's kind of how this system works. So here's kind of the electoral map for the 2016 election. As you can see up at the top, Donald Trump won the electoral vote. He had 306 electoral votes to Hillary Clinton's 232. And on this map, you can kind of see the breakdown of where all of Donald Trump's electoral votes came from. So Ohio, with its 18 electoral votes, voted for Donald Trump. You can see a lot of the Midwest went for Trump as well as the majority of the South. Hillary Clinton tended to do well on the West Coast and on the East Coast. Trump tended to do better in the Heartland and in the Midwest. So you can take a second look at that, kind of see how the electoral votes from each state are divided up. So how are the number of electoral votes for each state decided? Because again, if we look back at this, every single state has a different number. Where does that number come from? Well, the number of electoral voters that you have, or electors that you have, comes from your number of U.S. House of Representatives plus your number of U.S. Senators. So in the state of Ohio, if you remember, we have 16 House reps and we have 2 senators. So 16 plus 2 is 18. So therefore, we have 18 electoral votes, as you can see on the map. Now, let's get to the most controversial part of the Electoral College, and that is the question of, can someone win the presidency without winning the popular vote? And again, like I mentioned earlier, the popular vote is who receives the most votes. So who did the citizens cast more votes for? And the answer to this is yes. You can win the presidency without winning the popular vote. And in fact, this has happened in U.S. history 5 times. The most recent being the 2016 election. So if you look at the little bar graph down here, you can see the electoral votes at the top with Donald Trump on the left having 306 votes. and Hillary Clinton having 232. But if you look below their portrait, you can see the percentage of vote that they got. Hillary Clinton received basically 3 million more votes across the country than Donald Trump did. But Donald Trump won more individual states. That means in the state of Ohio, more people voted for Donald Trump. In the state of Michigan, more people voted for Donald Trump than for Hillary Clinton. So you can win enough individual states that it ends up putting you over the top with electoral votes without the entire the population as a whole voting for you. And that tends to be pretty controversial. This happened, like I said, in 2016. This also happened in 2000 with George W. Bush and Al Gore. Al Gore actually won the popular vote, if you see down here at the very bottom, by about 60,000 votes. But George W. Bush ended up barely taking the electoral vote with 271 votes. So that's a really quick, brief rundown of the Electoral College and a general basis of how elections in the United States work. When we get into class, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Why do we have the Electoral College? What was the argument for it? What was the purpose for it? We'll talk a little bit more about the primary and caucus process, what that looks like, and how we choose our candidates for elected office. And also just kind of debate, do you think the Electoral College is a good idea? Make sure you go from here to take the quiz on Schoology. Have a great night, and I will see you guys in class.